Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for being here today. My name is James Saryerwini. I am a software development engineer at AWS. And I work on the AWS command line interface, as well as the AWS SDK for Python, also known as Boto 3. And today I'm going to be talking about automating AWS with the AWS CLI. So I'll show you tips, techniques, and tools that you can use to automate various AWS tasks that you might have. And I'll be doing this with the AWS CLI. So I assume most of you are familiar with the AWS CLI and have used it before. I still remember tagging the 1.0 release of the AWS CLI just over 2 years ago. It was a very exciting time. We were all very excited. And we had put a lot of work in getting to the 1.0 release. And we could not wait to see how customers were going to use the AWS CLI. And in those 2 years, we've had a chance to talk with customers to see how they're using the AWS CLI. And in general, we observe 2 usage modes. Now, the first mode that we generally see people use with the AWS CLI is this interactive mode. That's where I have a terminal open. I'm running AWS space EC2 space some command. And I might be doing this for a number of reasons. Maybe what I'm doing is exploratory in nature. I'm looking for, say, a new service. I'm exploring the new service's API. I might be debugging or troubleshooting. Or perhaps a task that I'm doing just requires a one-liner. Copy a file from my local file system to an Amazon S3 bucket. It's a one-liner in the CLI. But we also see this other usage mode, and that's where customers are taking CLI commands and combining them together, using the CLI almost as a toolkit, as an SDK, to build these higher levels of abstraction that are useful to them. And I don't expect you to be able to read all this, but you get the idea that you're combining local commands with CLI commands to provide some useful functionality. And if we think about an AWS API call in general, there's a spectrum where on one end, we're making a single CLI command listing all of my buckets. And on the other end, we're writing a full web application that has many components, integrates with various AWS services, and has a lot of domain-specific logic that is particular to my business or my application. And so what we're going to focus on in this talk is this area right here. I am a big believer in using the right tool for the job, and I think that shell scripts fit an area where it's good to use. And I want to go over what I think makes a good shell script and what we'll try to stick to for this talk. So for me, a good shell script is less than 100 lines of code. By that I mean, actual commands. If we break a line into multiple, if we break a command into multiple lines, count that as one line. And it's generally things where you're running commands in sequence. So run command A, run command B, run command C. Or we might be taking output from one command and figuring out how to pipe that into input of another command. And we have relatively simple domain logic. So this is things where like, if resource exists, take action A, otherwise take action B. Or if command fails, take action A, otherwise take action B. And so we'll be looking at shell scripts that meet these characteristics here. Now, to get the most out of this talk, I'm making a few assumptions. There's a lot of things that I want to show you, and so I will not have time to cover things like installation and configuration. So I assume you're at least familiar with the AWS CLI. You've installed it, configured it, hopefully ran a few commands before. I also assume you're familiar with Bash, at least the basics. And I assume that you have some familiarity with AWS. Now, you don't have to be an expert in this. I will be covering the topics as we encounter them. But to give you something a little more concrete, if you understand that this first command is showing me my 64-bit instances, and you understand the second command, say, is looking for the 2 largest files in my current directory with string CLI, so command substitution and piping, and then you're familiar with Amazon EC2, which is where we're going to spend most of the time for the services, then you should be OK for this talk. If not, there is some good resources here, so these slides will be available after the conference, and I have some links here for some additional material. There's talks to the previous reInvents, to 2 previous reInvent talks, a beginner talk, and then some more advanced features, as well as links to our installation and configuration guide. And the last note is that we will be in the terminal quite a lot. I think that the best way to show these techniques is to actually give you concrete examples. And I want to stress here that the whole point behind this talk is to give you the techniques and the best practices so that you can write your own shell scripts that match whatever needs you have. But I will be picking some examples to demonstrate the techniques we're going to look at. OK, so now I want to cover some common patterns here. And before we do that, I want to have a quick refresher on some of the CLI basics. So I'm not going to go over a lot of the CLI. I just want to go over the key features we're going to be using throughout this talk so that if you're new to the CLI, you can still follow. Or if you haven't seen these features in a while, it's just a quick refresher. So the two big ones that we're going to use are, so by default, you get JSON output. And the two things that we're going to be using is output text. So if I do output text, hopefully this is something a lot of you have seen before. But you'll notice, if you haven't, that it's the same data from my JSON output, my first command, but it's just represented in a tabular format. So you have tab-separated data with records separated by new lines. So we're going to use that a lot. And the other thing that we're going to use is this query option here. So this allows me, again, to do a client-side filter. So if I take this data here, and I apply this expression, you can see that it's the same data, so US West 2 here corresponds to US West 2 here, and so forth, that I'm just taking that data and reconstructing it in a way that only gives me the data that I want. And one last note here. So if I select a specific region, let's say I want to grab that first element, region name, notice here the default is JSON. So this is something that I see a lot in shell scripts. This is a common mistake where by default, JSON strings are double quoted. But if I specify output text, notice that difference there where it's not quoted. So this string is actually the double quote character followed by EUS1 followed by another double quote character. And so if you're trying to feed that into subsequent commands, that generally will not do what you want. And so you want to make sure to use output text here. So keep those in mind as we cover these patterns here. And we're going to go over some key patterns. And these patterns are 4 patterns that I see most frequently used in the CLI. And if you know these 4 patterns, you can pretty much automate any of the AWS tasks that you might have. And so we'll go through each of these. And then after the first 2, we'll look at a demo and an example, and we'll cover the next 2. So the first one is the most straightforward. This is where I want to take output from one command and feed it to input into another command. So conceptually, if you think of this as the output on the left, I'm going to take some specific slot and feed it into input on the right. So I might run some sort of describe call and then feed that into a run call or a delete call or something like that. And the way you do this, if you're familiar with Bash, it should be pretty straightforward. You might try something like this where I'm using command substitution. So the intent here is I want to run an instance and then tag it as soon as I run it. But one of the problems that you'll run into is the error handling is not quite right. You will either have this command called with no value for resources, which would be a parsing error, or you'll send something to EC2 that may not have the right data, and you'll get a server-side error. So if you're running a shell script, probably the most common way I see this done is to use this pattern. There's a few ways to do it, but you explicitly call out each thing. So you're looking for the instance IDs from run instances, and then you're looking for, and then you use that value and create tags as that resource value. And you can imagine here error exit is just a function, a helper function where it prints an error message and then exits. And you can also use, if you're familiar with the set-e option in Bash, you have to be a little careful because there are some caveats there. And if you use this approach, it's a little more explicit. But in this case, you'll get an explicit error if anything happens. And again, we're running the query, so we're using -- query to grab the instance ID, and we're using output text. We're going to be using that a lot anytime we want to feed output into input. So that's something to remember. So a summary here, again, use query, -- query and output text. Make sure to handle the error cases. And this is for a one-to-one mapping of output to input. Let's move on to something that is a little more involved here. It's where we want to map a list of something in an output to n AWS calls. So again, imagine each of these boxes is an AWS CLI call. And so I might want to do something like list all of my IAM users, and then for each of them, I'm going to call some command, either add policy or either delete each of those users. And so the way that you can do this is with, there's two options. First, most straightforward one is just to use a for loop in bash. So again, if you're familiar with bash, hopefully this is pretty straightforward for you. And the way that this works is this first command here is going to create line-separated output. So in this example, it could be user 1, user 2, user 3. And then from that for loop, I'm then going to call the delete user for each username. So another thing that you can do is use xargs. If you haven't seen xargs before, this is a way to read from standard inputs, so of some process that's producing output, and map those to command line parameters. And what this is going to do here is I'm using this -i option that's a placeholder. So it's saying anytime you see this placeholder in the command I've been given, I will replace it with each line value here. So this will be user 1, then user 2, then user 3. And the reason that this is nice is that if I have independent tasks, so tasks where they don't need to combine results into a single result, and I don't have to worry about if one command fails, don't run any of the other ones, I can actually use this -p, which is max procs, and it's going to say run 10 of these in parallel at a time. So I will essentially get parallelism for free. And if I actually look at the output of something like pstree, I'll actually see 10 child processes from xargs running at the same time. And you can see this user name filled in. So there's user 1, user 2, user 3. And that was from that line output that we saw earlier. So if you're going to do this, make sure that you're going to use -i for xargs, -p for parallelism if you have independent tasks. And the for loop is good if you're trying to for loop over something that isn't exported in your environment. So if I create a function in bash and I don't want to export it, then I would have to use a for loop here instead of xargs. And it also is handling errors here, because if there's any error in that first API call, then I don't loop over anything because there's no output written to standard out. OK, so we've looked at the first two patterns here. And I'd like to be a little more concrete and show you an example. Let's work through an example here that illustrates these 2 points. So one of the most common things that I do that I'm going to use as an example is a lot of times I want to have a development EC2 instance just up and running, and I want it to use the latest Amazon Linux AMI. And I would ideally like it to just spin up, wait for it to be available, verify SSH fingerprints, and just SSH in and tell me that it's available. So we'll look at an example of how we can use these techniques to build up to that. So the first thing I'm going to do is write a script that gives me the latest Amazon Linux AMIs. And we'll work through how that looks like. I'm just going to have a function here that's going to say list AMIs. And it's going to take a region name. And you're going to provide that region name here. And first, I'll just go ahead and echo the region name and make sure that I have everything set up. Because the way I'm going to call it is I call list AMIs with a region. And so if I go ahead and run this, make sure that we get US West 2 as output. OK. And now we can start working on the script. So I happen to know that the call that I want is a describe images call. So I'm going to go ahead and do describe images. And I'm going to give it filters that says only give me the Amazon Linux AMIs. And I've gone ahead and worked out what those filters are. So I'll just go ahead and walk through them here. I want Amazon Linux AMIs that match this pattern, that are 64-bit HVM EBS root volumes of the new GP2 or the general purpose SSD types. And then I'm going to go ahead and provide a region here. And this region is going to be the region that was passed in. So if we run this command, we'll actually take a look at the output. And we'll see that it has the data that I've requested, which is 64-bit root device EBS GP2 volumes, owners of Amazon. And now what I want to do is start seeing how I can make this more useful for input into other commands, like the EC2 instance command that we're going to look at in a second. So now what I'm going to do is use the two things that we had been talking about, query and output text. So I need to figure out a query expression that's going to give me the output I want. I'll go ahead and say that I want tab-separated output, and I want to have, say, 4 fields: the region, the image ID, the name, and the description. So one of the things that you will run into is you will need to create a query expression that matches this value here. And I want to show you one of the first tools that we're going to look at. This is a tool that allows you to take JSON input and manipulate it to work out what your query expressions are going to be. So if I pip install jamespath-terminal, by the way, that language that we've been looking at is called jamespath. And so this will give me a terminal where I can actually pipe in data. So I can say something like describe regions, pipe it into JP-term, and then go ahead and start working out what that expression should look like. So things like regions.region name, and I can see how it looks like as I start working on these expressions. Now, what I actually have here, if you've noticed, my editor is Vim, and I have a Vim plugin set up where I can actually go ahead and generate a sample response here. So let me walk through what just happened there. I have this EC2 describe images call, and so I'm going to highlight it because here I don't have a query option, and I want to figure out what that's going to be. So I'm going to highlight this, and it will parse out what that command is supposed to be. And all of these commands have a JSON model that describes all of its inputs and all of its outputs. And it will then, based on that, create what the sample response should be. So if you look at this data here, notice these are just sample. This is just dummy data. So it's just mirroring the names here of these structures and using true for Booleans, that kind of thing. But what this lets me do as I'm writing my shell script is to work out what that expression should be. So I can see that, OK, I know that I need to grab images. And I want a tab-separated output. So I'm going to have the region name that was provided to me. And then I can look here and see that there are a description, an image ID, and a name. So I can go ahead and map those. And notice as I'm typing, it says null. And once I get to the right field, it says image ID. And then I can say name and description. So I have this worked out. This is the data that I want. I see I'm going to get a list of lists. And once I exit out of this, notice here on line 16 that it filled in my query for me. So as I'm working on my shell script, I'm able to work out what that is. So if I undo that change, right, and then redo it, you can see filled it in there. So that's a nice way. It didn't make any service calls. It used it purely based on the description of the model that it has. And it lets me create these shell scripts without having to actually make API calls. So if we run this, we should get tab-separated output here. I'll make it smaller for just a second so we can see this tab-separated output. And if you see here, so if you see here, there's 2015, 2014, 2015. So it's not quite in the order that I want. And there's also these RCs. So what I want to do is sort them real quick, get the latest version, and then filter out the RC so I can have the latest Amazon Linux AMIs available to me. So we'll take a look at what that looks like. So all I need to do now is enhance that expression. And since I've already seen the fields, I don't actually need to hop into the JamesPath terminal. I know I just need to do a sort, and I want to sort the images by the creation date. And I know in this case that I want them reversed because I want the most recent first. So I'm going to go ahead and add a reverse here. And then the final thing is that I want to be able to remove anything that has RC in the name. So the way that's going to work is I'm going to have a filter expression that's going to say only include images where it does not contain in the name the string RC. Let me break that up, make it a little easier to read. And so now this should have the data that I want. If I run this command, see here that I have 2015 at the top, I have 2014 at the bottom. If I then want to work with other tools, I can say, OK, let's take the most recent one and give me the AMI ID. And then I can use that as a call into run instances. And now that we have that all set up, there's one other change that I want to make. So this gives it to me for a single region. What I'd like to do is use one of those things that we saw for doing a for loop over multiple API calls. And so I'm actually going to say that I want to see the latest AMIs for all regions. So I'll say for region name in, and then I know that I'm going to do describe regions. We'll leave query blank. And then we'll have text output again. And for now, I'm just going to echo the region name, make sure that I have everything set up here. And I need to figure out that query expression. So again, I'm going to highlight it, know that I want to say regions.region name has the data that I want, so I'll go ahead and exit. And now if I run this command, I should get just the regions. And finally, I can go ahead and replace this with region name. And I should now have a list of all of the latest AWMIs for each region. So that's using that second pattern there because I have a function, and I'm showing the latest Amazon Linux for each region. Now, I have all this set up, and I want to use this in another script. So I'm going to add an option where you can give me a region name, and I'll only show you the AWMIs for that region. Or if you don't provide any arguments, I'll go ahead and do this behavior now, which is show you all regions. This is the last enhancement we're going to make to this. So I'm just going to go ahead and write that real quick. I'm going to say if you don't provide any arguments, then we'll go ahead and do this loop. Otherwise, we will take a look at the parameter you provided. If it's region, then we'll go ahead and grab the region name. And then we're done with that. Otherwise, we will go ahead and echo a usage error. So we'll just say error usage should be the latest AWMIs with an optional region flag. OK, we'll write that as standard error, and we are all done. And then we actually need to run the command, so let's put it here. OK. So now what should happen is if I run this with a region, should only get AWMIs for that region. Same thing for US West 1, and otherwise it'll do it for a loop. OK, so we've worked through that example. There's another example here, and I'm going to go ahead and let this run in the background here, and we'll come back to it. But I just want to show, and I'm not actually going to code this, I'm just going to walk through it real quick. But I want to show how we can take that tool and then start combining tools together, hopefully to give you an idea of what you'll be able to do. So now I have a script that says, OK, let's use that script, grab the latest AWMI, and then launch an EC2 instance. But let's do more than that. Let's wait for the instance to be available. Let's wait for SSH port to be available, and then let's SSH into the instance. And you'll see that that's actually the script that I ran here. We'll take a quick look at the output. So it launched the latest Amazon Linux AWMI, and it's going to wait for it to be in a running state, and it'll do a couple of other things that we'll walk through. So the way that this works is I'm going to grab the latest region. So the environment variable, I'm looking for AWS default region. Otherwise, I'm calling AWS configure get region to grab it from the config file. So that's one way you can do defaults. And then after that, I'm going to grab the latest AWMI. I'm going to print what that value is. Remember, we have tab-separated output. And then we're going to call launch instance. And we'll just take a quick look through launch instance, just to give you an example of what this does. First thing it's going to do is find a tag security group. So it's going to know what instance or what security groups to use with this instance. It's just one that I have tagged. And then we're going to run this run instance call with the image ID we found, some fixed values here. And I'm grabbing the instance ID. Next, I'm going to tag it. And this is a call that we saw earlier. And now we arrive at waiters, which is something that I want to highlight real quick. So there's this command here, AWS EC2 wait instance running. And what this is going to do is block until the instance associated with the instance ID I provided hits the running state. So in the background, it's making a describe instances call. It knows where in that response the instance state value is. And it's going to check if it matches running. And if it doesn't, it will sleep for a little bit and then try it again. So this saves me from having to write all of this logic myself. It handles a lot of edge cases, and it also can work with multiple instance IDs. So in this case, I'm using one, but I could have done this with multiple instance IDs. Now, once we have that done, we will go ahead and grab the instance host name. So that's the public DNS name. We'll wait for that port to be available. And once that port's available, we'll actually SSH to the instance. And I want to go over this real quickly, just because there's a little bit to it, and we'll see how you can start integrating with some of the local commands, as well as AWS CLI calls. So what I want to do, if you remember whenever you have a new EC2 instance and you SSH into it, the first thing it says is, are you sure you want to SSH into it? Here's the fingerprint, and you have to say yes. You always just type yes. And what I want to show is, here's a way you can actually verify the fingerprint using some of the SSH commands you have available to you. So the next thing we're going to do, you give it the instance ID and host name, and we're going to use another waiter. So again, this is saving us from having to poll. We're going to wait for console output to be available. Once it's available, we're going to look at that console output. Again, notice we're using query and output text. We're going to look for the fingerprint there. And then we're going to use an SSH key scan to start looking for the public key. We're going to save that to a file. And then we have some commands here that are actually going to generate a fingerprint. And it's going to show you what that fingerprint is, and it compares it. It says if the expected one doesn't equal what the actual one is, then we'll error out. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and add that instance ID, or that public key, to our known host, so that when I SSH onto the instance, it will actually tell me that I won't get prompted, and I'll just have something available for me. And also, and this command here is just a Mac-specific thing. This will actually give me a desktop notification when it's ready. So if I'm off doing something else, once it's available, I can actually just go ahead and switch over to the terminal, and everything will be ready. So that's a script that hopefully gives you some idea of how you can start combining components together. It worked by taking small composable tools and then started to build abstractions onto them based on things that I found useful, which is the latest Amazon Linux AMI, the latest security groups that I have tagged. All of that data is very specific to my use case, but I'm using these techniques. So we saw using query, -- query, and then -- output text. And we also saw an example where we used the for loop to grab the latest AMIs. OK, go ahead and switch over here. Looks like they're taking a while. Oh, here we go. So I think it's just because we have the notifications with the dual screen setup. But you notice here that I'm actually now on an EC2 instance. So I can run AWS commands. I have my home/EC2 user. So this command basically set everything up for me, and I can now go ahead and start doing some development work. OK. So that was the first two patterns. And hopefully that gives you some ideas of what you might be able to do with that. Now I want to look at the third and fourth patterns. Now, the third and fourth patterns are a little bit different. Up until this point, I've been saying use output text and use query. But this one's a little bit different. The biggest reason is in scripts that are a little more involved, sometimes you'll have multiple contexts you want to use values in. So for example, I'm going to make some call. And then I need part of the response for the first part of my script. I need the middle part of the response for the next part of the script. And then finally, I'm going to use the last part for the last part of my script. And what I would want to do instead here is rather than figure out the query expression up front, I'm actually going to store this all as a big JSON variable here. So this can be, say, EC2 instance data here. That's just a long JSON string. And then later on during my script, what I'm going to do is say, OK, now I need to know the volume ID for the first block device on my instance, maybe for EBS snapshots or something. And then later on in my script, I say, OK, maybe now I need the image ID because I'm doing some AMI-related work. And then later on in my script, finally, I need the instance ID. And so what's nice about this is it makes it still very easy to read your script. You can see, OK, I have the image ID that I'm working with. I have the instance ID that I'm working with. And I don't have to do this tabular format where I have to remember the second column is the image ID, the fourth is the instance ID. It lets me be a little more explicit. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to introduce a new tool here. And that's this JP command. So far, we've been looking at -- query. And the main thing with -- query, it's this expression language that lets you take JSON and filters it down to whatever you want. Now, that's part of the CLI as a -- query option, but the JP CLI is the exact same language, just as a standalone executable. And it allows us to do the query thing that we saw on the previous slide. And so for Mac users, it's also available for a homebrew, so you can brew install it as soon as you brew tab jamespath/jamespath. And I want to show you how you can now use this in your scripts here. So the way you would do this is you would make a call, such as run instances. And notice here the big difference is I'm not using output JSON. I am using output JSON, so I'm not specifying -- output text. And I'm going to save this as a variable. And once I save that as a variable, I now have this query function. And notice, again, this is a JSON string. And if we look at this query function, it takes two arguments. You give it the instance data, so this is the JSON string. And you give it an expression. And -u is just saying don't print any double quotes there. And now in my shell script, I can start doing some things like, OK, I need the instance ID as a variable. Or now I need the state.name. Now I need to find the instance name. So that's in the tags list, the key that has a value of name. Grab the first value in that list. And this lets me create these shell scripts that are much easier to read here. And we'll see an example of that in a few moments. So if you're going to do this, remember, use JSON output. Do not use text output. Save the whole thing as a variable. So in this case, I knew that the instance ID the instance data wasn't that large, and so I'm just holding it as a variable, but you can also write it to a temp file if you're concerned about memory usage. And then also use the JP command to filter down results as needed. It's the same language as -- query. You don't have to learn another language. It's all the exact same thing. And then now I want to cover the resource exists check. So this is another pattern that I see very commonly, which is check if a resource exists. If it does, take action A, otherwise take action B. And the way that you do this, there's 3 parts. Essentially what we're going to do is try to create some sort of list, and if that list is empty, the resource doesn't exist. If the list has something in it, then the resource exists. And we do that by either giving me the query to run or giving me server-side filters and then applying a query. And the way that works is that you have, first you're going to have 2 arguments you give me, the command and then also the query to run. If you don't, we'll just look at the first list in this output. And then after that, we're going to go ahead and run the command. And if that command has any matches, or errors, we will go ahead and error out. And then finally, we'll check the length here. So if the number of matches is greater than 0, then we'll return 0. Means the resource exists. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and return 1, saying the resource does not exist. And I want to show you some examples of how you can use this. So for server-side filtering, this is an example where I want to check if a particular EC2 security group exists. Now I would say if resource exists, and I give it this command, and I give it a server-side filter with a particular tag, then I have code path A that says the group exists. Otherwise, I say the group does not exist. There's also client-side filtering. So this is an example where the service does not have server-side filtering. And I'm going to show an example here for instance profiles. And here I'm going to provide a query expression that's looking for an instance profile with an instance profile name of dev EC2 instance. And if it does exist, then we'll go ahead and print it and say the profile exists. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and say you're missing a profile. We can go ahead and call a create for it, offer to create it for them, whatever else you might have. And if you're going to do this, remember, conceptually what we're doing is taking a list, checking if the length is greater than 0, and we're going to try to use server-side filtering when possible. Otherwise, we're going to use the James Path query thing for client-side filtering. And we went through that pretty quick, but I think a demo here will help solidify some of these things. Now, I'm actually just going to show the code here, give you an example of what we're doing. So one of the problems that I run into is if I take a look at security groups here, and actually, let me go ahead and remove or grab out the defaults and SSH. So I have 3 security groups here. And the columns here show the group name, so that's the first column. And then it shows a group ID. And then it shows a description here that's saying that A allows anything in security group B. You notice for security group B, it allows anything in C, and C allows anything in A. And the reason that this will need a script here is if I actually try to delete the security group, and I give it an ID of, say, the first one, it'll get an error, and it'll say you have a dependent object. Then I'll go ahead and try to delete the second one, and I'll get an error. It says that I have a dependent object. So then I think it probably is the third one that I need to start with, which is wrong, because they're all dependent on each other. And what I need to do to actually get this working is I need to delete all of the rules associated with that security group. So if I say describe security groups, there is output here that has IP permissions that says what this security group is allowed, and it's referencing another group ID. So what I'm going to need to do is blank out all of these IP permissions, and then afterwards I can go ahead and delete it. And so we're going to see an example of this third pattern here, which is what we used before. So notice the query function. So that's what we looked at in that third example. And the way that we're going to use this is we're going to call a describe security groups to see if it's there. If it is, if it's not, we'll go ahead and exit. Otherwise, we'll echo what the security groups are, confirm that they want to delete it, and then we'll go ahead and say, this is the main logic here. Notice the usage of query. We're going to say how many groups are there. For each of them, we're going to have extract out the group ID and extract out the IP permissions. We're going to revoke the security group ingress, giving it the group ID, and then giving it the IP permissions. And this is a JSON document that we're feeding directly into this command. And that's our first context there. And the second one is going to say, OK, now that we've done that, we can actually go through and delete the security groups. So if we run this, let me give it a name. So in this case, it's looking only for security groups with a particular tag. We'll go ahead and give me a list and say, here's what you're about to delete. Are you sure you want to do this? And I will go ahead and say yes. And you'll see that it's going to do it in 2 steps. It's going to revoke the ingress rules, and then it's going to also remove the security groups. And that is an example of how you can use query functions to be able to do multiple contexts here. Switch back over. By the way, make sure that there's no EC2 instances associated with the security groups before you revoke them. OK. So we looked at 4 patterns here. And if you learn these 4 patterns, there's pretty much all of the AWS tasks that you'll need to automate you'll be able to handle. I do want to quickly go over some of the deployment tips here. By that, I mean, let's say that you write your script, everything's working, and then you decide, OK, I want this to run in cron, or I want this to run in some job runner. These are just a few tips that I've seen people run into that I want to make sure everyone's aware of. So from running in cron, one of the things to keep in mind is there is some implicit state that the CLI relies on based on who is running the process. So I look at home.aws/config as well as the credentials file. So if I have something set up as my dev account and I have everything working, and then depending on how I set up my cron job, if I'm using cron.d or cron.daily and not the user cron tab, it'll be running potentially as a different user, possibly root. And so if you're going to do that, you have 2 options. You either need to explicitly set these environment variables to some config file that you have set up specifically for this cron job, or you just need to make sure that the .aws/config exists for whatever user you might be running as. And other thing is you'll need to configure a region. So the CLI needs credentials, and it needs a region in order to be able to run commands successfully. And so this is an example here where I'm using the instance metadata service on EC2 to find the currently configured region, and I'm using the AWS configure set command to set my region. So I'll either put this in user data when I launch the EC2 instance, or I'll put this as part of some sort of initialization script. And this is a way that you can get all of your cron jobs set up. So I just wanted to show those 2 quick tips here in case you start running into issues when you want to go to deploy these shell scripts. OK. Sorry here. So I want to take a brief detour for just a quick moment and talk about the community. You know, one of my favorite parts of working on the AWS CLI and Boto3 and the other AWS SDKs is the fact that it's all open source. It's all developed on GitHub. And so we really enjoy when we get contributions from the community. We enjoy when we get feature requests or just general feedback. And we also really enjoy when customers take our tools and build higher-level abstractions on top of that. And I want to highlight one particular tool that was written by a community member, who I believe is here today, Don Martin. He has written a tool called saws. If anyone has heard of that or seen that, it is a great tool. It allows you to do things like tab complete or completion as you type. It does auto-completion of server-side resources for the CLI. It does syntax highlighting and fuzzy searching, and a lot of really cool stuff that you should check out if you have the chance. And I'm mentioning this because it turns out that we were also working on something similar. And we actually had the chance to sit down with Don here at reInvent. And I am happy to say that we are going to be combining efforts and merging projects. We'll be taking, having an official project with all this functionality combined together. It's still at the very early stages, so I don't have a lot of specific details. I don't know the exact details yet. But stay tuned, it is coming. But in the meantime, I wanted to leave you with a preview of some of the features that are coming. So this is a project we've been working on called the AWS Shell. And it addresses one of the problems that I didn't really talk about so far in this talk. And that's as I've been writing these shell scripts, I just knew what commands they were. I knew that I needed to call describe images. I knew what the filters were. I had a little bit of help with that plugin to figure out the query expressions. But for the most part, I just knew. And we want to address a way where you can actually make this process more streamlined, where I can have some contextual help to just tell me what commands I have available and what options I can provide. And so the shell provides completion of resources and services that give you a list of things. So I can start typing things like EC2, and it shows me all of the commands. And also notice it pulls up documentation here, too, so I can see what that command is. And so as I start typing, thank you. There's more. So as I start typing, I run instances, the docs here. If I do dash dash, it'll show me what fields are required. So I can see here that the image ID is required. So I can go ahead and type that. And as I start typing that, again, it'll pull up documentation for me. It also does things like, I'll put in a value there. If I'm picking something like placement, and it'll say that it's a structure for the placement for the instance. If there's any CLI users that have used a shorthand syntax, you know this is actually a shorthand value. So if I hit space here, it will show me the shorthand syntax, but also offer to autocomplete it for me. So I can go ahead and hit tab here. And then let's say in this case, I only want US West 2A. So I can go ahead and do those kind of things. There's also a couple of other cool features. One of the other ones it does, the CLI commands, they're very explicitly named. Describe, reserve, instance, offering. It's very clear what command you're running. But sometimes you might want a more succinct way to specify that. So it does things like fuzzy searching. So I can say DRIO, describe, reserve, instance, offering. And we'll go ahead and do a fuzzy search here of all of the commands. So I can go ahead and just tab complete that. Same thing if I have like reserved instance offering IDs. It will tab complete that. And again, pull up docs for me. And it also lets you do things like specify part of one word and part of the next word. And the other thing that I want to show here, I'll actually run one of these commands, that it's just the CLI under the hood. So it's just a way to show you and help you figure out what commands you want. OK. And probably one of the really cool things is that if I say like term inst, I can see the instance IDs are required. And if I go ahead and provide, say, IDs, hit tab here, tab completes server-side resources. So it shows me what instance IDs I have available to me. So I can go ahead and just tab complete that. And that was actually the instance ID we just spun up earlier. So one of the great things about this also, if there's any Python developers or any users of the AWS SDKs, you know that some of them have a resource model. And there's things where it's basically an object-oriented interface where I can say instance.terminate, instance.stop, that kind of thing. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because that model tells us what operations are available on an instance. It also tells us how we can describe those instances. And the reason this is all relevant is because we can actually take that data and generate how to do server-side completion. So any resource that's available in Boto 3, you can do auto-completion for, basically for free. So things like EC2, IM, I can delete users here. It does autocomplete for usernames, all that kind of stuff. And to bring this back to shell scripting for a moment, so I have a little more context here to help me figure out what these commands are, how I can start running them. But now I've figured it out, and I want to convert that into a shell script. So one of the things you can do here is do a .edit. And we'll take all the commands that I've run and open them in an editor. And so then I can start converting this to a shell script. So things like bin bash, and then start figuring them out, and maybe call this instance IDs, and then replace this with IDs. So I can go ahead and creating my shell script based on what I figured out here. Then save that as my scripts, something like that. And go ahead and exit out. OK. So that's a quick preview of some of the things that are coming. Again, I said we'll be merging projects. It's at the very early stages, but look out for it. It's going to be very, hopefully, useful, and people will find it helps them be more productive with the AWS CLI. All right. Now, that was all the content I want to share. Here's a quick summary. We looked at common patterns. We looked at some shell script examples. By the way, all these code samples will be on AWS Labs, and this project that I just showed you will also be on AWS Labs. We looked at some tips for deployment with cron, and then finally I showed you a couple tools, Vim plugin, JP term, the JP executable, and then the shell project. Please remember to complete your evaluations. It's how we can improve and do better. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference and all the activities tonight. And once again, thank you.